Hello there, welcome to the Saroid channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you, and I do hope you're having a fabulous Christmas season because you deserve to have a wonderful Christmas and of course a fabulous New Year, and I wish that for all of us, and just so many thanks to all of you who listen to my channel. I so appreciate it, and I'm so delighted you enjoy the stories, because I love the fact that you enjoy listening to them. And there's nothing in this world, as I've always said, that beats a good old story. And this is one you're going to really love. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with the story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I was 9 years old at the time. It was the early summer of 1954. I was wearing my Pinocchio pyjamas that matched my duvet cover and pillows, and was locked in the throes of a deep sleep, caught up in the world of my fanciful dreams that I would have no memory of when I woke up the following morning, as more often than not I never recollected the substance of my dreams. I had gone to bed that night with a heavy, somewhat wilted heart, determined to shut out the raised, affronted voices of both of my parents. They were having a heated argument again, and predictably it was all about money. When would it ever stop? When would they stop arguing about money, I wondered. Whenever my parents fought, it was unquestionably always about their finances. But they never argued in front of me. But I always knew what was going on in our household, because children invariably are a lot more savvy than adults credit them to be. It didn't help, of course, that my mother's shrill voice carried over a large distance, like a whistle on the wind, and seemed to unabashedly penetrate the very thin walls of my bedroom, so that every single word she screamed out was crystal clear. I'd lie there alone in my bed, with my melancholic eyes fixed on the ceiling, and believe me, I knew that ceiling as well as the veins of my own hand, for I studied it at great length. I would try not to listen to my parents as they tirelessly argued, often late into the night. Sometimes tears would trail down my cheeks, for it was very distressing for me to hear the two people I loved most in the world tear each other apart like a couple of ravenous coyotes fighting over a measly bone. I wished with all my heart this ongoing caterwauling would stop, for my parents' arguments would make me feel desperately insecure about the foreseeable future in my young life, for I knew fighting like this was like a ticking time bomb on my parents' relationship, and one day that bomb might go off, and my life as I'd always known it would implode and be obliterated into thousands of pieces of shrapnel, never to be the same again. Because once you break a piece of fine china and try to stick it together with superglue, despite your very best efforts, that piece of china is never the same again, and adult relationships can be equally as fragile. I'd often fantasize about being a pirate with a treasure chest that could radically change the dynamics of our lives. I would imagine myself returning home from my voyage across the 7 seas, and surreptitiously bring the treasure chest that I had acquired from my intrepid expeditions, by plundering the ill-gotten gains of the excessively wealthy, who had far too much money for their own good. Anyway, I reasoned to myself, with a Robin Hood-like perspective on things, that taking away from the rich to give to the poor seemed justified enough. I would envisage myself taking the treasure chest filled with a plethora of valuable, opulent, precious jewels that came from the treasuries of kings and queens, and I would strategically place it on our hardwood floor in our living room, close to the open fireplace there, leaving it there rather like a Christmas stocking, waiting to be opened on Christmas morning. When my mother found the treasure chest filled to the brim with diamonds, precious jewels, and gold, she'd let out an ear-piercing, shrill scream. But the good kind, of course. My father would go rushing into the living room, believing something quite dreadful had happened to my mother, and thinking she must be under some kind of attack. That thought made me grin like a Cheshire cat, as I imagined my father's startled reaction when he entered our living room, for he would discover my mother dancing around joyfully, draped in the extravagant finery of diamond necklaces, bangles, rings, and tiaras. My father's eyes would look like bugs, because they would be popping out of his sockets so much, because they were that wide, and he would say, "What the hell?" which were the words he used frequently when he'd been taken by surprise. "Where did all this treasure come from?" he'd ask my mother. My mother would smile gleefully and say, "I don't know, but it's ours now. Finders keepers, as they say. We're rich, Ambrose, very rich." My parents would begin to dance together, doing twists and turns to some background jazzy music, which would mysteriously switch itself on, so that my parents could enjoy dancing together, while basking in their great fortune that had serendipitously touched their lives so magically. It would almost be as if they'd rubbed Aladdin's lamp and made a wish that had been answered by an ancient genie of sorts. They would not realize for a single second that their son was actually a pirate and had brought back all this treasure for them from his adventurous, intrepid soirees across the seven seas. And from then on my parents would never utter an angry word between the both of them, because the bills would all be paid, and we'd never want for anything again. This was a common reoccurring dream of mine. I guess you could say that even though I wasn't exactly conscious of dreaming at night, although I know I did, I would enjoy this kind of wistful daydreaming during the day, as such hopeful reverie would wipe our family troubles fast away, like the windscreen wipers wiping away the raindrops on the car windscreen window when it's bucketing down with rain. Such was my young desire to exterminate my parents' financial problems once and for all, as I knew unequivocally, even at such a young, impressionable age, that if they were not so many financially crippling issues in our lives, and an accumulative infestation of bills that needed to be paid, that were piling up on the desk in the hall, some of which my mother was clearly too afraid to open, that my parents would not fight or be at each other's throats all the time. Indeed, if my parents had a pirate's treasure chest overflowing with diamonds, they'd never worry about money ever again. And if that were the case, I wouldn't have such an extraordinary tale to tell. Every night when I listened to my parents' arguments, it really was like listening to a couple of actors on stage rehearsing the same old lines again and again and again. My mother playing the part of the aggrieved, hard-done-by housewife, my father the husband who'd reached the end of his tether because of his financial worries. Ostensibly I worried that one day my parents' marriage would implode, as you can only beat a watermelon so many times before it finally breaks open and all the pink juicy flesh comes bursting out. I knew in such beleaguered circumstances I'd be forced to choose between both of my parents, who I would live with, and that was a decision I never wanted to have to make, for I loved my parents equally as much, and I never wanted anything to split them up. "Well, what do you expect me to do, Ambrose?" I heard my mother's shrill voice abruptly break the still silence in my bedroom. "I can't work if I'm looking after Bentley. Someone needs to be here to take care of him. It's a full-time responsibility being a mother, you know, and taking care of a young boy. I have to take him to and from school, don't I? As well as sort out his extracurricular activities. How dare you insinuate I'm lazy? What do you want me to do? Take a job at night? Is that it? Work as a barmaid or a waitress? Are you completely insane? Do you have any idea how difficult it is to look after a 9-year-old boy? It's a full-time responsibility, let me tell you. By the time I put Bentley to bed, I'm absolutely exhausted. Who cooks the meals around here? Think about that for a second. Who reads Bentley a bedtime story in the evening? I notice it's never you who volunteers to help. Who cleans the house, does the washing and ironing, not to mention the weekly shop? I do it all, Ambrose. But what appreciation do I get for all my troubles? Only more unreasonable demands. I was not judging you, Coco. I do appreciate that you do a lot around the house. You misunderstand me. I'm just concerned about the bills, that's all. Half of them you haven't even bothered to open. We have to pay them, love. We can't ignore them. They are not magically going to pay themselves. So together we need to find a practical solution to resolve this problem. We need to put our heads together and come up with a solution. So you're saying I need to take on another job when you come back home from work, is that it? I'm not stupid, Ambrose. I can read between the lines, you know. You're making your implications very, very clear. How dare you even give such thoughts house room? By the time you come back from work, I'll have you know I'm utterly shattered. I haven't got the energy to do another job. I'm completely spent.
I'm not suggesting you get another job per se, Coco. But it did occur to me that you could do something at home while watching over Bentley to bring in a little extra money for us. Every bit helps, love. Why don't you make jam or cookies to sell at the local store? The extra income would be very useful and would make a big difference and go a long way to contributing to our bills. We need to be creative around here to make things happen, don't we, love? It's just a thought. There you go again. It's so typical of you, Ambrose. You think I should work myself to the bone, don't you? Is that it, Ambrose? Don't I do enough around here already? For the record, no one would buy my jams or cookies because I'm a useless cook that can just about make macaroni cheese, peach cobbler, and the occasional piece of poached fish or chicken if I'm very lucky. Beyond that, my culinary prowess is very limited, and you and I both know that very well. You're always complaining about my cooking, and now all of a sudden you think I can wave a magic wand and miraculously become like Mrs. Beacon or Julia Child. Are you stark raving mad? Why is the onus all on me all of a sudden? As if I'm the one who has to bring in the extra income, and not you. Why don't you find a better job? Mr. Bringstone is paying you pittance as far as I'm concerned. Surely you can find a better job. If you had a more sufficient job, we wouldn't be in this mess, would we? What do you expect me to do, Coco? Came my father's indignant voice. Jobs don't grow on trees, do they? You make it all sound so easy, Coco. I've got news for you. Life is not like that. You know that, and I know that. I will have you know Mr. Bringstone doesn't pay me that badly. It's the bills that are the quintessential problem in this household. They're making me lose sleep at night. They just keep piling up, and we have to do something about getting them paid before we start getting those dreadful final reminders in the post. It might help if you didn't spend so much money, love, because then we might be able to pay our bills and put some money aside to save up for a holiday. I mean, wouldn't it be fun to take Bentley away somewhere special, like to the Great Lakes or something? It's all my fault again, isn't it, Ambrose? It's always my fault as far as you're concerned. That's the only tune you ever sing these days. You're like an annoying cuckoo clock, aren't you? I'm spending so much money, am I, Ambrose? I'm not saying that, love. I just think perhaps you could become a bit more thrifty, that's all. How dare you, Ambrose? You don't even know what you're talking about. Why is the finger always accusingly pointed at me? As if in some way I'm to blame for our dwindling finances. For your information, I don't overspend at all. I don't take kindly to your suggesting that I do. As far as I'm concerned, the ball is in your court, so you make the first serve. Look, love, I wish it was that simple, but you know it's not. As I keep saying, we need to put our heads together and think of an innovative, creative way in which we can raise some extra money. We need to get those bills of ours off our backs. I've been thinking I could take on some weekend jobs as a handyman. I'm pretty good with a paintbrush, even if I say so myself. Well, then do it, Ambrose. I think I just may. But you could do something too, couldn't you? You're creative. I'm sure you can think of something. I don't have to listen to you whittle on and on about practical solutions in which to pay our bills, Ambrose. I've had enough, my mother screamed. I've got news for you. There are no practical solutions, unless, of course, I go to my brother cap in hand and humiliate myself again by asking him to dole us out and get us out of this pickle again like he did last time. Is that what you want? Well, asking Chester for help might not be such a bad idea, love, came my father's voice. He's a good man, love, and I know he would be more than happy to help us out. We would pay him back, of course. Any day now, those final reminders will be in the post. We need to get them paid as quickly as we possibly can. And if your brother can help, well, that would be a huge weight off the mind. How dare you, Ambrose, expect me to go to my brother again, cap in hand, and beg him to bail us out? That's not fair to him or me, and I just won't do it. I'm sorry, but I won't. Every time you return from the office, all you ever do is harp on and on about the bills. It's driving me insane. Is there anything else we can ever talk about in this relationship of ours other than money? But, love, we have to talk about our financial issues. We can't bury them under the carpet and pretend they don't exist. That's called living in denial. We need to address this problem full on. It's not going to go away on its own," said my father in earnest. "I've had enough of you going on and on about this, Ambrose. It's making me physically sick talking about money the whole damn time. I can't bear to look at you right now." And with that I heard our front door slam, and the clip-clop of my mother's wedged heels, flouncing down the driveway, along with the familiar rattle of her car keys. My mother could be heard getting into her Chevy, as her car engine angrily burst into life, as the wheels of my mother's Chevy screeched as she tore off into the night, like a wounded animal, going off to lick its wounds. I knew she was going to her best friend Sally Turner's house, and would be gone for quite the while, until her indignance had worn thin, and then she would return home with her tail between her legs, feeling a tad foolish for overreacting. I knew my mother would probably be talking late into the night with Sally Turner over a glass of wine, telling her how perfectly dreadful my father was. I knew what Sally Turner was like. I'd heard her prattle on at great length about how much better off my mother would invariably be if she wasn't married to my father in the first place, and I hated Sally Turner for inviting my mother to even entertain such dreadful thoughts. Ostensibly, Sally Turner visited my mother during the day, always bringing along with her her banana and walnut bread. They would sit together in the kitchen drinking lemon tea and eating the walnut bread. I would sit on the kitchen floor, my little legs crossed over each other, playing with a selection of toy cars and pretending to be fully absorbed and entertained by my game. My young impressionable ears would be wagging furiously as I eavesdropped on their conversation, and I never liked the toxic poison that Sally spewed out of her mouth, for she spoke as someone who absolutely abhorred men, and reminded me of a green praying mantis, who would wholeheartedly like to eat her partner alive, if given the chance. But I didn't think any sensible man in his right mind would ever want to be with a woman like Sally Turner, unless they had a death wish, of course. I think Sally had resigned herself to being a spinster for the rest of her life. She was one of those women that had never been lucky in love, and even at 9 years old, I secretly suspected she wanted Mum to also become a spinster like she was, so they could hang around together all the time, as two lonely single women who had nothing better to do than knit cardigans all day long and gossip to their heart's content. "Look at me, Coco," Sally Turner would regularly say. "I'm single, footloose and fancy-free. Why don't you move in with me? I'll help you look after Bailey. Imagine the fun we would have together, the two of us, living together like two sisters and raising your boy. The best thing you can do is divorce Ambrose. Get that annoying man out of your life once and for all. I promise you, girl, you'll be so glad you did." "But I love Ambrose," my mother would protest. "I know we have our arguments, but I couldn't imagine my life without him. He's a good man, you know. He makes me laugh, and we have some great times together. Besides anything else, he's a fabulous father to our Bentley. I couldn't ask for a better husband. He's attentive, loving, and has a great sense of humour, so he makes me laugh a lot. I've always found him very attractive besides." "You're deluding yourself, Coco, you really are," Sally would say, almost sounding infuriated that my mother had the audacity to stick up for my father. Sally would start drilling my mother with 101 reasons as to why she should leave my father, and her heartless words would practically burn my ears because they were so cruel, like throwing petrol onto an open fire. "You would be much better off without Ambrose in your life, my dear, and a whole lot happier too, if you ask me. You don't need a man like Ambrose to prop you up, Coco. You say you love him, but look how miserable you've been of late. If you're unhappy, my guess it's your marriage that is the root of all these problems. You only have to admit it to yourself, and then the other part of the problem is easily solved. Just get a divorce. Be done with it." "I don't want a divorce, Sally. I'm not miserable because of Ambrose," my mother would retort. "I get mad at him all the time, I admit that. The man knows how to rile me up, and you know that well enough. Some of the things he says at times make me mad, but he's not the reason I'm miserable. I'm miserable about the damn bills that keep piling up and up. It's so overwhelming. I feel like I'm swimming in the deep end of a pool and I can't find the shallow end. All the steps so that I can finally get out and draw breath again. It's exhausting. All these insufferable bills are practically drowning me. On this occasion, after my mother had had an argument with my father and was now on her way to Sally Turner's house, I knew exactly what my father was doing. My father would remain at home and medicate himself with a couple of stiff drinks. He was partial to drinking brandy and coke. He'd sit back on the couch in the living room, read a newspaper or a good book that he'd taken out from the local library, while he'd wait very patiently for my mother to return home from her visit with Sally. My father did not like Sally Turner any more than I did. He could see through her artful motives, as if she was a transparent pane of glass. My father definitely knew that Sally was masterfully trying to turn my mother against him, and he would say as much to my mother. But my mother ignorantly disregarded his comments, because she didn't like a bad word to be said about her friend. "I don't know why you're friends with the Wild Witch of the West," he would say to my mother. "She's a bad influence on you, Coco. I wish you'd recognise that. Can't you see no man has ever been interested in the likes of Sally Turner? Quite frankly, she's a miserable, lonely old bat, and the only thing that would make her attractive is if she had a personality transplant. She's on her own for good reason, for no self-respecting man would touch that caustic woman with a barge pole. She's green at the gills because you have exactly what she secretly wants. She'll never admit to it, of course. You are married with a child, and she wants to destroy what we have together, so she can invariably feel better about herself. And you can become as lonely and as pathetic as she obviously is. That's what she ultimately wants for you, Coco, and you call her a friend. You keep running to her every time we have an argument together. It's a little pathetic, don't you think? Every time you and I have a quarrel, Sally gets her claws into your skin a little deeper and tries to convince you that getting rid of me is in your very best interests. I'm not stupid. I've got a very good idea about what you women talk about when you get together. And it's not about how good the weather is. You don't know what you're talking about, Ambrose. Sally has been my best friend since high school, I may remind you. I think I need to remind you of a few things, love. You yourself told me that one time Sally Turner was so jealous she deliberately spilled red cherryade all over your white prom dress. So at the very last minute you had to find something else to wear for the occasion. And what about the time she cut your hair when you fell fast asleep? Because one of the boys that Sally secretly liked told you that you had pretty hair. She was so furiously jealous she cut yours short. Who does that? You were mad with her for doing that to you, and wisely didn't speak to her for a couple of weeks, until she broke down in tears and apologized profusely, admitting to you that she was jealous. You told me yourself that Sally thought that if she cut your hair, the boy that liked you might end up liking her. But you looked cute with your hair short. But the boys weren't interested in you because you were pretty. They were interested in you because you were a sweet person, Coco. So your friend's clandestine antics failed to work, and for some reason you felt sorry for her. God knows why you've always been a soft touch as far as Sally Turner is concerned. You've always been far too quick to forgive her. That might be true, Ambrose. And yes, she was jealous back in the day. Sally never had good skin, you know. It was always breaking out, and it didn't do her any favours. Besides that, she tirelessly struggled with her weight, and it didn't help that she was always so desperately grumpy all the time. I suspect it was the latter that made the boys rather reluctant to befriend her. Sally hasn't changed in that regard. She can be cantankerously grumpy, but she's not jealous any more, I can assure you of that, Ambrose. She genuinely cares about me, and she's become a good friend to me over the years. Tell yourself that as much as you like, Coco. I don't believe a word of it. My mother always used to say growing up that a leopard doesn't change its spots, and I agree with her on this one. Every time Sally has joined us for dinner, and more recently it was 2 weeks ago, I always got the profound sense she is jealous of what we have together as a family. If she can't have what we have, the next best thing she can do is to tear us apart, and that's what she would like to do. You say yourself that she's told you on numerous occasions to leave me. Well, that's true enough, my mother would admit. But I'm sure Sally doesn't really want to break us up. She's had issues with men over the years, that's all. And her relationships with men have always flatlined. I guess it's left her feeling rather bitter, bereft, and rather resentful towards the opposite sex, who have never found her attractive, it would seem. You can say that again, my father retorted. That woman absolutely abhors men, and men pick up on that bitterness very quickly, let me tell you.
Later that evening, my mother would predictably return home, after spending time with Sally Turner, where she invariably nursed her wounds over a couple of glasses of wine, while Sally was almost certain to give her some toxic advice about her relationship with my dad. Once my mother entered the house, my father would lightly take her lovingly into his arms, as he always did, and apologize profusely about upsetting her so much, and then all would be well again in the household. The house would settle into a peaceful slumber, and then I would drift off to sleep feeling a whole lot better, almost as if the cloud of heaviness that had hung over our home had just been lifted, and I'd persuade myself that all the former worries I'd engaged in about my parents splitting up were all just pie in the sky. Of course they loved each other, I would tell myself. Yes, the bills got them down, but at the end of the day their love could ride through the most tempestuous of storms, and on the other side there was always the promise of a rainbow. I had to believe that. That evening, after my parents' argument, I hasten to say I never heard my mother return home, for I was caught up in the throes of a very deep sleep. All of a sudden my sleep was rudely interrupted. I woke up with quite the start. My mother was silently shaking my shoulder. She flipped on the bedside lamp rather abruptly, so much so that the bright intrusion was almost blinding, and it silently tortured my bleary eyes, that were still congealed with the debris of my sleep. "Get up, Bentley," said my mother, in an earnest whisper. I glanced at my Mickey Mouse clock on my nightstand, and realized it was already 6 o'clock in the morning. It was a Saturday morning, and on the weekend my family slept in late, so I couldn't understand why I was being bustled out of bed like this. My mother stealthily put a finger on her lips. She gestured for me to remain as quiet as I could. "I don't want you making a noise, Bentley," she ordered. "I want you to get dressed as quietly as you can. Do you understand? Your father's fast asleep on the living room couch. You don't want to wake him up, do you? He deserves a good night's sleep, does he not?" I looked up at my mother in bemusement. "Where are we going?" I asked. "I don't want to get up now, Mummy. It's Saturday morning. It's so early. We sleep in on Saturdays, don't we? And Daddy makes pancakes for us." "Not on this Saturday, we don't. Don't be a lazy bum, Bentley. We're going to my brother's farm for the weekend. Won't that be fun, sweetie?" she said with an awkward lilt in her voice. That was her beleaguered attempt to sound cheerful, but it didn't fool me for a single second. I knew my mother was clandestinely up to some kind of mischief, the likes of such she didn't want my dad to find out about. Otherwise we wouldn't be creeping around the house so furtively, like a couple of burglars on the prowl, just so as not to wake him. I climbed out of bed, albeit rather reticently. A frown bedecked my face. I methodically put on my clothes, while my mother began to wilfully throw a tangle of my clothes that she had pulled out of the closet with a furious haste, and piled them into an old suitcase that she'd thrown on my bed, and struggled to close, for some of the material got stuck between the open cracks. My mother began to swear silently under her breath, of which I could smell the residue of last night's wine. I wondered how much wine she'd knocked back at Sally Turner's house, as Sally Turner loved plying my mother with excess alcohol. The suitcase wouldn't shut. "Damn you!" she cried out in frustration, pulling out one of my sweaters and throwing it across the floor, where it lay in a sad-looking forsaken bundle. Finally, she managed to shut the suitcase once the offending article had been fully removed. What the hell was my mother doing? Why was she in such a tearing rush to get to my uncle's farm, I wondered? And why would I need so many clothes for just a weekend? I tumbled out of the back door of our house, with my mother trotting behind me. Before I knew it, I was sitting in the passenger-side seat of my mother's gold-coloured 47 Chevy. "Everything's going to be fine, Bentley," I told myself in a self-soothing chatter. which I always adopted when I sensed something was profoundly wrong. The tyres squeaked as my mother's indignant Chevy left our open carport in quite the spin. I sat in the front seat, staring vacuously out of the window, where the fine ethereal light of the new morning shimmered over the horizon, in a glittery silver-like haze. There was not much activity around this Saturday morning, apart from a lone jogger with his 2 chocolate-coloured King Charles spaniels jogging past us. Beyond the tweeting of the birds from our neighbourhood trees that lined the sidewalk, all was uncomfortably still. I was somewhat surprised to feel the rise and fall of my own chest, which was not something I would normally have noticed. My mother's eyes were silently fixed on the road ahead, and her somewhat trembling hands were clutching the steering wheels tightly, so her white knuckles were showing, while a vein stood up angrily in her hands. Her lips were pursed tightly together in a thin line, while her brow furrowed enough to reveal an emotion that was somewhere between upset and anger. I knew my mother was pretending to be happy, for I'd made a study of her mannerisms almost as a game since I was a little boy. As without any brothers and sisters to occupy my time or attention, I found other little idiosyncrasies in my young life to amuse myself with, and this was one of them. Ostensibly I could read my mother like a book. My mother continued to drive down the long windy road. The smokestacks of Detroit disappeared in the silvery grey horizon. I watched the rows of houses rapidly pass my window, as the sun slowly rose behind the roofs, casting a beguiling golden glaze over the sky. It seemed strange to watch the world pass us by, waking up slowly and surely on the Saturday morning, rather lethargically, as most people were snugly tucked away in their beds, for there wasn't a soul out and about. Soon the roads opened out into wider, more friendly spaces, where shadows of fields passed us by as we headed north. My mother's silence on this journey was rather unusual, but it was also deafening, because when my mother was this silent, it always meant she was irate. So I was almost afraid to say anything, but then the words burst out before I had a chance to rein them in. I tried my best to make my words not sound like a whine, and said, "Why are we going to Uncle Chester's?" At this point my mother's Chevy was making its way down Route 25. My mother did not answer my question for a brief moment, almost as if her mind was 100,000 miles away. But then she briefly glanced down at me, her eyes betraying her obvious annoyance. She said rather defensively, "Why are you asking me all these questions, Bentley? Why do you always ask so many damned questions? You're just like your father that way. In fact, you're very like him. I thought you loved your Uncle Chester's farm. I thought it would be very nice to go there for the weekend. And you'll enjoy seeing your cousin again, won't you? It'll be a change of scene, won't it? All the fresh air will do us both the world of good, don't you think? It'll be a nice surprise for Uncle Chester to see us, don't you think?" "I do like Uncle Chester's farm," I admitted, because I genuinely did. "There you go, then," said my mother pointedly, as we drove through Birchville, passing all the quaint cafes and charming little restaurants there, along with all the boats that dotted the twinkling, glittering surface of Lake Huron. Finally, we found ourselves on a 2-lane highway, and then, after quite a while, my mother finally took a familiar turn down a bumpy dirt road that would soon lead to Uncle Chester's farm. I drew in a deep breath. There was so much I desperately wanted to ask my mother, but I was afraid to do so, lest she bit off my head. Why had we surreptitiously slipped out of the house so early in the morning? Why was my mother so determined to leave Dad sleeping on the couch? She knew if he slept there overnight he'd wake up with a very stiff neck, but she didn't seem to care about that. So I deduced in the circumstances she must be exceedingly angry with my father. She hadn't even bothered to put a comforter on my father, but had left him there fast asleep, uncovered all night. I knew that maybe Sally Turner had put my mother up to this. Probably some of her lethal poison had finally seeped into my mother's head and influenced her thinking. I suspected my poor father had patiently waited for my mother to return home last night, after she'd stormed off in quite the huff. My dad had lightly sat there on the couch, waiting for my mother to return, and had not awoken when she'd come home. For if that had indeed been the case, he would have apologized to my mother profusely, as he always did, and the two of them would have made up, and then they'd both have returned to bed. My parents always had a belief that one should never ever go to bed feeling aggrieved, and not having settled an argument. I knew my father would wake up later that Saturday morning, wondering where on earth me and my mother had got to, unless of course my mother had been courteous enough to write him a note, which somehow seemed rather doubtful, I thought. My mother surreptitiously whisked me away to my uncle's farm, and my dad didn't know about this, and the thought made me feel sick to my stomach. Very often it was my mother who goaded my father, and it wasn't the other way round. What my mother was doing was intrinsically wrong, and even at 9 years old I knew this to be the absolute truth. Granted, my parents did have financial problems and struggled to pay the bills, but why was my mother so unreasonably dramatic about things when my dad was only guilty of trying to find a practical solution to our family's financial problems, while my mother always took offence to any of his suggestions, almost as if in some way she thought he was deriding her? I mean, was it really so bad that my dad had suggested my mother bake cookies and jams for the local store in town to raise some much-needed extra cash? It was true my mother was a lousy cook, but why did she always overreact to everything and go off on quite the tangent? I suspected this random trip to Uncle Chester's farm was my mother's way of punishing my father for their argument last night. My mother was the kind of person that could hold a grudge for quite a long time, and was not very quick to forgive. But I could sense, based on her current very stiff demeanour, and the way she was grinding her teeth together so furiously, that she was obviously still very aggrieved with my father, and had not yet forgiven him for the previous night's argument. So we've reached the end of the first part of this story. The second part of the story is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.